Good afternoon. Welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government and to the PeopleGov Conference, Global Perspective on the Future of Public Service. We are delighted to have this space to reflect and discuss about how can we improve and transform governments across the world, rethink their leadership, and get ready for the current and future challenges. Almost 3 years ago, the Blavatnik School of Government launched the People in Government Lab with the purpose to have a global research center focused on studying and understanding public employees' behaviors, motivations, attitudes, and values in order to improve the performance of governments and the public service delivery. Today, it is a pleasure to share with all of you some of the work that we have been doing during this time, from interviewing senior officials and heads of civil services in the 6 continents to understand what were the main challenges and what were the main changes that happened as a response of the pandemic, to applying surveys and running experiments to improve public employees' well-being and performance while working remotely. Welcome to the PeopleGov conference. You are an important part of this network, and we invite each of you to engage in the discussion, to enjoy the conversation. And I want to thank you, the whole team in the PeopleGov team, for the effort and the work that they have been doing, the leadership of the school for all the support, and the support of Brava, Lehman, Humanize, and Republica Foundations, the support that they have done to the lab. To open the conversation, I would like to invite the Dean of the school, Nairi Woods, to give the initial remarks. Nairi, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you. And, a huge thanks to Margarita Gomez, to Martin Williams, to Claire Lieber, to the extraordinary researchers, many of whom you've already met over the last 2 days, for their fantastic work over the last couple of years. Here at the Blavatnik School of Government, every year, as we do our admissions for the Master of Public Policy, as we look at the people coming to our short courses for the heads of public agencies, the thing that we notice more than anything is what extraordinary people are attracted to the idea of public service. And as Margarita said, one of the reasons for the school building the PeopleGov lab was a sense that what the public service could usefully do is to be constantly thinking about engaging and being able to access research into how better to deploy those extraordinary people, how best to attract, recruit, motivate, mobilize people in the public service. I think it might have been Dustin, but I don't want to misquote Dustin Brown, who you're going to about to see, but it was the head of a people function in a government, who reflected to me with sadness that public services all around the world attract truly fantastic people who are driven by a mission. They want to help people. They want to make people's lives better. They want to take responsibility for the job that's entrusted to them. And somehow in so many public services around the world, within a matter of days or weeks, they're turned into box-ticking bureaucrats. And I guess if I were to summarize our ambition for the PeopleGov Lab, it's how to help public services really get to the first of those things, really get towards being organizations that attract those extraordinary mission-driven people and unleash them to take responsibility for making lives better in their societies and countries so that they can do that effectively. And so it's with a real joy that I see all the participants of this conference, when I see the discussions and conclusions of the last couple of days and this fantastic 3rd day, which looks forward. So thank you all for your terrific work and contribution. And thank you, Margarita, for bringing us all together.
Thank you, Nairi. Thank you very much for these initial remarks. Now, I would like to invite Bruna Matos. She's a project manager at the Brava Foundation. And Bruna, The floor is yours, and thank you very much also for all the collaboration and support during this time.
Thank you, Margarita. Thank you for having me. Well, good morning, afternoon, or night, depending on where you are. I'm so happy to be here today with this global audience and to have the opportunity to take part in the International Conference of the People in Government Lab. I represent Brava Foundation. We are an independent NGO working with the agenda of digital and innovative transformation of the public sector in Brazil. And ever since we started developing initiatives in this agenda, we were frequently taken by a certain surprise whenever we asked practitioners, decision makers, academics about what would be the most crucial pillar for creating a more digital, innovative, responsive, and transparent government. The reason we found ourselves sometimes so frequently amazed is because we would expect the answers to be and to gravitate towards things like technology, as in we don't have the certain tools, we need to develop solutions, or processes such as in we need to redesign our internal practices as to reflect this new paradigm of technology. These are all important factors. I've had the opportunity to, 3 weeks ago, to gather 50 mayors here in Brazil, and they all mentioned the importance of technology and processes. But the most crucial pillar for creating a more digital, innovative, transparent, and responsive government is definitely people. And by understanding the centrality that people, and by people I mean civil servants, have for the agenda of digital and innovative transformation for the public sector, Brava, in collaboration with 3 other NGOs here in Brazil, namely Lemon Foundation, Humanize Institute, and Republica.org, we have had the honor to support the People in Government Lab in fulfilling its mission of putting people, fantastic, mission-driven people at the center of the government transformation. And that's not just a beautiful statement, because through the last years, we have had the opportunity to follow People in Government Lab work in creating evidence on how society, and more specifically government, can create and implement actionable ideas to redesign the way we think public management of people in the public sector. Well, after COVID-19, and I risk being redundant here, these efforts, they have not only become necessary, but an imperative. The last couple of years imposed transformations that in a different context, they would have taken years to be put into place. And therefore, they also represented a large-scale laboratory for the implementation of multiple practices in the agenda of people management. And we now face this precious opportunity to reflect upon these practices without the emergency they have been implemented. And in other words, we can intentionally decide what works and must stay and what has to be changed. And also from now on, we have this other precious opportunity, which is to adopt a more strategic and forward-looking perspective on people management in the public sector. So we will not be taken by surprise when the next wicked problem, global crisis, hits us. One of the insights I believe that COVID-19 has brought to us is that we can still thrive in times of great complexity and great pain, but we need to be prepared to do so. And in the light of this scenario, the existence and the contribution of People in Government Lab will continue to be fundamental to bring evidence-based practices regarding topics that are now so important and widely known, such as leadership, motivation, the impact of remote work, what it means to create practices of well-being for public servants, is and so on. Leslie, I would like to share two personal insights that I've had taking from my experience working with this amazing team of the People in Government Lab. The first one is that despite our beautiful diversity and the acknowledgement that different contexts, they bring different demands, I can say with relatively confidence that we as countries, we share many common challenges, and that we can use this to put in practice my second insight, which is we can cooperate in finding solutions, we can share our experiences, and we can help each other overcome our shared problems. Today's event is a celebration. We'll have the opportunity to get to know more about two core researchers from the People in Government Lab, but it's also an attempt at achieving this network of collaboration between people who think that putting people, fantastic, mission-driven people at the center of the government is the key that will allow us to build a more transformative government. Thank you very much, Nighty Woods, Margarita, for the confidence and for the opportunity of supporting this work. And I wish you us all a great session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruna. Thank you for these kind initial remarks. And without further comments, I would like to invite Martin Williams, who is an associate professor of public management at the Blavatnik School of Government and co-director of the People in Government Lab. Martin, please, the floor is yours for the second session. You're going to have a great discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Margarita. Thank you, Bruna, as well for your really thoughtful comments, and thanks, Nairi, for helping get us started today. So in a few moments, I'm going to introduce our first panel of the day. But prior to that, we have two items of business. The first of which is that you should be seeing a poll open for you to vote on. So we would like your thoughts on what's the main priority for the reform and leadership agenda for civil services going forward. We'll talk a little bit about how civil services have changed over the past 2 years in coping with the pandemic. But for the poll, what we're interested in is what are your views on what's the priority, the single most important priority going forward. We'll collect those poll results. I'll ask the same question to our panelists, and then we'll have a look at the poll results later. The second item of business is to provide a little bit of a recap on the small group discussions that we've been having with kind of focused research groups over the last, research and practice groups over the last 2 days. And so those 2 days of discussions have corresponded roughly to the two large research programs that the People in Government Lab has been running, which Margarita and Bruna both mentioned. The first of which is the Voices of the People in Government project, in which we interviewed 14 heads of civil service and senior public management officials from around the world about what they saw as the main transformations that had occurred during COVID and what the agenda is and should be going forward. And also a project on remote work and the future of work in the public service. And you'll notice that those two topics correspond more or less to our agenda points, or to our two different sessions today and our two different panels we have. We won't be presenting the findings of those, but we'll put them in the chat so that you can read those reports. And we'll just be having a kind of more open discussion about these two sets of challenges. Yesterday and on Wednesday, when we were talking about the challenges and transformations that have occurred over the last 2 years and that are now facing civil services going forward, I think one of the key themes to emerge was a number of tensions between different imperatives that civil services are facing. So one tension is between the kind of dual need for, on the one hand, speed and flexibility and innovation and delegation of decision-making, and on the other hand, stronger processes of coordination and the need to coordinate and collaborate across more teams, more organizations, more sectors than was necessary before. A second tension was between the idea that there are, especially in a kind of moment of crisis, There were all kind of processes and controls that were normally in place in the civil service, some of which were found to be kind of hindrances, some of which were bypassed, some of which were reformed. And there was a tension in some cases between those and between delivering on really urgent priorities. And yet there's also, and we see around the world now, a kind of recognition that actually some of those processes and controls are quite important, both in normal times and even in crisis times. Maybe there were some processes and controls that shouldn't have been set aside. And how do we think about rebalancing and reinstitutionalizing what that should look like? A third tension was about the distinction, or the kind of dual need to focus on both short-term operations and delivery targets and processes, but also long-term thinking, creating space for innovation, space for investment. And the fourth tension, and relatedly, is on the idea that there's a kind of pressure for efficiency always and cost reduction, but also a need for some organizational slack in order to be able to make those kind of investments, to come up with new ideas, to set strategic priorities and directions. One of the really interesting things that emerged both from the last 2 days and from the research that we did as a lab was that people are pretty consistent in saying that, you know, these were not challenges of COVID per se. These were challenges that existed before, that exist with lots of other complex problems that are going to exist going into the future. And similarly, the ideas and some of the things that got put in place to try and reconcile these trade-offs also weren't necessarily new. They weren't pandemic specific. They were often an acceleration of things that were on the agenda before, but now took on greater urgency. And a final, I think one of the ways in which lots of these things came together and the ways that people did try and reconcile these trade-offs was a kind of deep questioning of the way that hierarchies operate and organizations operate in the civil service. That, you know, the idea of a kind of hierarchy is so central to how most organizations think of themselves, how we conceive of processes, of targets, of responsibilities, of career management. And yet there was a need for kind of new management practices, new modes of leadership, and new ideas, new flexibility, and differentiation of what management and leadership mentioned across different types of tasks, different people working in different places and through different modes. So as you can see, there's a pretty rich agenda for today. The challenge now that I'm going to put to our three panelists is to help us reflect some more on some of these tensions and make sense of them. So we're going to turn first to Dustin Brown, who's Deputy Assistant Director for Management at the Office of Management and Budget in the United States. Despite the kind of diminutives deputy assistant, he's actually quite important and involved in quite a lot of interesting transformation initiatives in the United States government, both during COVID, but also before. So Dustin, can you share with us some thoughts about what do you think are the most important transformations that have happened over the last 2 years, and how do those correspond to the challenges that are facing civil services now going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and great to be with you. Thanks to Nairi as well, and Margarita and the Blavatnik School. It's been great to collaborate with you all over the last few years. And really have these forums to kind of share what's working, what's not, and create that kind of international dialogue, I think has been really key to the opportunities in front of us. So just in terms of the US context, we have now completed in all of our agencies kind of our reentry plans as people are kind of gradually coming back into the workplace, albeit obviously it's not going back to pre-pandemic types of work. There's a lot more flexibility, a lot more telework that is available. But nonetheless, we're working through all the implications of that, working in hybrid environments, obviously, and managing kind of a different type of work schedule, including, you know, a big increase in the number of people who are available for remote work. So we are kind of in that phase where we are learning from the initial plans that have now been implemented over the last 2 or 3 months, as we kind of try to figure out what the new normal looks like, and using that feedback to be able to chart kind of the future that we want to be in. So that gives you maybe just a little context about where we are kind of across the US federal government, which has about 2 million civil servants, 85% of which are outside Washington, DC. So I think that's always an important thing to remember too, just how distributed our workforce is. So I really just had three key takeaways I wanted to share based on, I feel like, what we've learned over the last few years. The first is the need to mobilize whole of government tools. And whether those are policy tools, whether those are coordination tools, implementation tools, data tools, I really think the pandemic confronted us with a problem that was so complex, that was so multidimensional, that was so global. We really needed to leverage all of the kind of tools across government that we could, and make sure that the center of government was in a leadership role in providing kind of very regular updates to each of our agencies, each of our communities, and outside stakeholders. I think our team alone would talk to about 500 people every week through the different councils and committees that we had set up. And that kind of regular routine of listening to feedback on what was happening, what questions agency had, and be able to respond quickly to issues and incorporate that and make sure they also had the latest guidance from our organizations like CDC and could then translate that into the implications for how we were going to operate in government was absolutely critical. The second kind of key takeaway I think we have, and this is especially kind of happening now as agency reentry planning is underway and being implemented, is that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions for the way we are going to work going forward. And that the opportunity, and we've used a term, there's a leapfrog moment for governments. And I go back to Nairi's point about empowering civil servants and helping them really focus on the mission. One of the things that we've worked to do is really delegate and empower decision-making down to the lowest possible levels in terms of kind of how organizations want to establish their work environments, their work schedules, and the way they operate in their environment. And I think that has a tremendous amount of potential, because one of the things we did learn during the pandemic is one of the greatest strengths across the US government is its frontline supervisors. They did an amazing job. Our survey data shows that very clearly, just how positive our employees have been about the ability of their frontline supervisors to give them the guidance, the support, and the flexibilities in many cases that they needed to stay focused on the mission, which we were able to stay focused on even amidst major changes to our operating environments and stresses at home and all sorts of other challenges that have come along with it. So that ability to move from kind of a rules and compliance driven culture to really a people focused one, whether that's the people we're serving or the people that work for government, I think has been an important transformation in continuing to empower people to have that really as our true north, while we can maybe question some of the rules and even hierarchies and kind of one size fits all requirements that have historically governed our organizations. I think is actually kind of an interesting kind of opportunity to reflect on and take advantage of, that was kind of prompted by the pandemic that forced us to re-examine some of these things. And then the third thing I'll mention, last thing, is feedback mechanisms. This really kind of goes hand in hand with, I think, empowering frontlines. You know, in the past, if you had a potential challenge with an individual supervisor or manager, we would often create rules across you know, all supervisors and managers. This is a real opportunity through feedback mechanisms and data to be able to better understand where you have challenges, where you have strengths, and be able to follow up based on data that we're getting back from some of the surveys that we do, whether that's of our customers, and we have a really robust effort to get more data from the people we're serving on the quality of services and how we can improve service delivery, or our own workforce. In addition to an annual survey that we do, we put in place pulse surveys for the first time ever with just 3 or 4 questions that we were able to put forward, which was really an empowering tool, I think, for many of our employees to be able to be heard, but not necessarily through an exhaustive 90 question survey, which our annual survey is, but just 3 or 4 that really kind of help us get some quick feedback on how some of the work that we're doing is going. And I would just put a plug in as well for the President's Management Agenda that was released in November by the administration, which really did focus on 3 things: improving our customers' experience with government services, the federal workforce, and the tools of government, managing the business of government. So very focused on exactly these themes, as well as some work I'm doing internationally with OECD, which just on Wednesday of this week released the first ever OECD Trust Survey results, which again, I think shows the willingness of governments increasingly to get kind of feedback from citizens on their trust and confidence with government, quality of the services, and a whole range of other kind of key drivers that look at these fundamental questions about how we're going to be effective going forward. So with that, I'll pause, but it's great to be with you all today and look forward to the questions and discussion.
Thanks, Dustin, for that. Those are 3 really fascinating insights. We've put a link in the chat to a working paper that Dustin wrote, which was released as a Blavatnik School working paper, we're fortunate to have Dustin as a visiting fellow here, about some of his reflections on what those tools at the center of government are that are available to governments to try and improve coordination and collaboration in the ways that he mentioned. Another point that you mentioned, Dustin, that I really wanted to highlight was, when you talked about empowering frontline supervisors, often when we sort of talk about questioning rules and compliance and hierarchy, people's mind immediately goes to, okay, well, the opposite of that must be removing rules and processes. And the opposite is not actually no rules and processes. The opposite is rules and processes that empower and that help people understand how to use their discretion, know what their role is relative to those around them and the rest of their organization, and be able to kind of both have the power and the information to be able to make good choices. So I think those were really, really important and interesting points. Our next panelist is Thea Snow. So Thea is the director of the Center for Public Impact in Australia and New Zealand. And Thea, I'm going to ask you the same questions that I asked Dustin. What do you think are the challenge or the transformations that have happened in the last 2 years that we need to be most aware of, and how does that correspond to the challenges going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and thanks everyone for your remarks so far. I'd just like to begin, as we do in Australia, with an acknowledgement that I currently stand on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I join you from Australia, where it's 10:30 p.m. at night, so I'll try my best to be coherent and concise, but this is not my best hour of day, so I just put that disclaimer out there. So I thought I'd just focus actually on 2 sort of concepts in my reflections. The first concept is complexity and this idea around legibility. And then the second idea is around transformation, because there's been a lot of conversation about transformation, and the word transformation is used a lot, but I've been thinking a bit recently about what does transformation actually mean? So I'll start with complexity. And I think that COVID is a great example of the ultimate complex challenge. And what governments around the world have found themselves grappling with is with an expression of complexity. And I often talk about complexity as the difference between surfing and making a pastry. So making a pastry is a complicated thing. I couldn't do it because I'm not a trained pastry chef. I haven't practiced for years and years. But if you give the right ingredients to the right person with the right skills, they can follow a sort of an algorithm or a set of steps and produce a predictable outcome based on that algorithm and their expertise and the right ingredients. A complex problem like surfing, you can't do that. So if you were a surfer and you got to the beach and you said, well, last week I got in at this point and I swam out 50 meters and I caught great waves. So this time I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Everyone would say to you, but that doesn't work when you surf. And that's because surfing is a dynamic, emergent, complex environment where the tides are constantly changing, the weather's changing, there may be more or less surfers in the ocean. And so the way that you have to approach something like surfing is fundamentally different from how you would approach making a pastry. You have to be constantly observing what's happening and responding in real time. So even if you're catching great waves at a particular moment, if the wind changes, you can't doggedly say, well, I've been catching great waves here, so I'm just going to stay here and hope that the wind changes again. You need to actually respond and adapt to that. And that's, I think, what's been happening in the context of COVID. Governments have been confronted by complexity in a very real way, which has required quite a different way of engaging with the challenge at hand, which is much more emergent, much more oriented around learning, requires a lot of sort of dependence on relationships and exchange of information and conversations. And ultimately, what we do at the Centre for Public Impact is try to work with our government partners to explore what does it mean to really embrace complexity in government. And I'm conscious that I've only got a few minutes now, so I won't go into that in great detail. But I think one of the really interesting and powerful things that we've seen emerge through COVID is government starting to grapple with this question of what does it mean to surf, if you want to sort of carry that analogy through. The other point that I thought I'd make is around transformation and what does transformation actually mean. And I've actually recently collaborated with a fantastic woman from Australia called Pia Andrews. We've written a blog together, which will come out soon, on the difference between iteration, innovation, and transformation, because I think that people often use these words without necessarily thinking about what they really mean. And when we talk about the transformations that we've seen in COVID, what do we mean by that? Again, the framework that I use to think about transformation is a framework called the 3 Horizons framework by Bill Sharp, where he talks about first horizon changes, which are business as usual, no change. Second horizon changes, which are disruptions or modifications to existing processes. So that's what I describe as either an iteration or an innovation. And third horizon changes, which are radical rethinkings and reshapings of existing processes and paradigms. That's what a transformation is. And I think it's really interesting, again, in the context of COVID, to think about what innovations have we seen that can lead to transformations, and what innovations have we seen that will revert back to business as usual. And I think, again, the language that we use at CPI is around imagination. And I think that there is a link between imagination and transformation, because creating new visions for a future state requires both individual and collective imagination. And Jeff Mulgan has recently been writing about the deficit of social imagination. So I think as we move forward in thinking about what do we want to hold on to and what do we want to transform, we need to be really thinking about using that collective imagination to take us beyond the innovations to new future states. So I'll stop there for now.
Pia, thanks so much. Pia, sorry, you mentioned your colleague Pia. Thea, thank you so much for for those remarks. And if I could, I'd love to use my kind of chair's discretion to give you a couple more minutes, because you raised this really kind of important question of what are the things that were kind of iterations or innovations that are sort of marginal changes to processes as usual, versus what are the more fundamental transformations, and which of those do we want to sustain and which of those do we want to let go, which of those do we want to push farther. And so I was wondering if you could just speak for kind of a minute or two about what are maybe one example of each that you see having come from this period.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the example that Dustin gave was a great one, around empowering frontline staff. I think it's certainly in Australia, we saw the same thing, and in New Zealand. And in another webinar that I was part of, a woman called Penny Hagan, who runs a co-design lab in New Zealand, she said such a beautiful phrase that I'll never forget. She said, "We've walked backwards into sharing power." In other words, government didn't know what to do. And so she was talking about in the context of working with Indigenous communities, where government didn't know how to get food to communities, didn't know how to encourage people to get vaccinated. And so what they did was they stepped back and they let go of power, and they said, you know your communities best, you know your people best, we trust you to do this, and we will get out of the way and create the conditions that you need to help your people thrive in the current environment. And so that is to hold on to that, for that to become a transformation, not just an innovation, what we need is a change in the beliefs around what the role of government is. That the role of government is to enable people to live good lives, and that the way to do that is sometimes by stepping out of the way, not always by controlling and delivering and designing the answers themselves. So that's an example, I think, of where we've seen some great innovations, and for those to stick and hold and become transformations, where we need the shift to happen is not just in what government does, but in what government believes its role to be in society.
Thanks so much for that, Thea. I think those were great examples, and I can see from the little floating emojis on our screens that a number of people listening agree with you as well. I loved your comparison between surfing and pastry making. And one thing that it had me reflecting on is that one of the challenges is that so many of our accountability processes and control mechanisms and ways we define targets, ways we define career structures are all built around pastry making. And I think a huge challenge for government going forward is how to protect the surfers. And not just force them to kind of paddle out to the same spot every day, even when the waves aren't there. So maybe that's a topic we can return to in questions. I want to turn now to our third panelist. So Diogo Costa is president of the National School of Public Administration in Brazil. He's also an academic and a researcher in his own right as well. So Diogo, you know the questions by now, so let me throw the floor over to you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you everyone at People in Government Lab, at Blavatnik. Thank you, Margarita. Thank you, Nair, for having us and for having this discussion. And as you provoked us, Martin, with thinking of what are the challenges that the past couple of years presented, I think many of the challenges, as Tia have said, were challenges that were already present before COVID. The world was already becoming more dynamic and more complex, and that means that we have less predictability. There's more discontinuity at trends. There's less mean reversion, which are traditional tools that we use to make predictions. And when we have a more unpredictable world, we need to be more agile, more dynamic. So one of these challenges is how to allocate talent when the world has become more dynamic. Talent allocation is a challenge for government, but not only for government, it's a challenge for the private sector as well. We see that since the 1960s, between 15 to 20% of growth in aggregate output per worker in the US could be explained by improving allocation of talent. And we see that visually, even when we see more minorities and more women taking positions of leadership. And in government in general, also, this is a current challenge. So there is a number of challenges that we identified in Brazil, and that as a School of Government, ENAP could help public organizations to become more agile in allocating talent. One of that is to help organizations hoard less talent. So there is a recent paper by Ingrid Hagel from UC Berkeley showing that when managers hoard less talent, maybe because they rotate to a new position, you see workers' applications for promotions increasing by over 100%. And many applicants who would not have applied to new promotions in this absence of manager rotation are 3 times as likely to, as average applicants, to land a promotion, to perform well in higher level positions. Also, this helps female workers to ascend to higher level positions as well. And in government, this is also a challenge. In a country like Brazil, where you have a very fragmented allocation of power within the executive branch, we've been helping leaders to actually become more fluid, to become more transversal in talent allocation. We started a program called Leaders That Transform, and there's one challenge, which is to make sure that talent allocation in the public sector is more fluid, but also that hiring processes to leadership positions is more streamlined. So there is also evidence that if you have less defensive hiring processes, which means that you have fewer steps, fewer veto points in these processes, then you can have better talent allocation. And that's also something that we've been doing with our government lab, Genova here. We've been helping different government organizations and also having our own platform that can help talent allocation be more fluid in government. Another challenge that has become more pronounced with COVID is the challenge of coordination. And progress depends on coordination. We understand more than ever that progress is a policy choice, that future is something that we need to build, not only something that simply happens to us. And modern democracies face a number of challenges to make sure that this choice happens. There's institutional sclerosis, there's vetocracy, the excess also of veto power. There's something that political scientist Steve Tallis calls kludgeocracy, which is the excess of efficient short-term solutions that increase complexity in the long run. And to be able to increase coordination sometimes is a tool that you can diminish these other effects. So to give an example of ENAP here, when in 2019 there were 31 schools of government within the federal government in Brazil. ENAP itself had 12 local units. And to make the move to our online platform, our virtual school of government, EVG, was a way that we could use a platform as a tool for coordination. So we worked with different government agencies. We established criteria for any kind of agency to become a school of government. Now there's only 14 schools of government, but many of them became a school in their own right because they're part of this platform. So we went from 60 to over 450 courses in our online platform. So we gave the ability and the agility for different government, for public managers and public officials in general to come up with their training, to solve their training needs with new platforms. But at the same time, we did this in a more coordinative way with less overhead costs, with more gains of scalability. So now we have an average of 100,000 students in our platform. We've certified over 1 million people through our platform. And that showed us that this can empower public managers with at the same time that they can help coordinate for to have more training powers within their organizations. Another way that we've been helping the coordination is helping organizations to do better evaluations. So we've been doing a program for matchmaking between evaluators and policy specialists in their own areas. So we put these specialists together to make new evaluations, and we've done over 50 evaluations in the past couple of years. And now we're designing a platform that can help also local governments to do that kind of matchmaking and this make evaluations, which is something that's very new for Brazilian public culture, much easier to be done. So this is, I think, some of the tools that we've been seeing that can help government overcome some of its challenges that have become, as I said, not new, but more pronounced during COVID. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thanks so much, Diogo. I really appreciated your thoughts on this, and in particular your reflections on these kind of challenges of coordination, of fragmentation, and kind of siloization of the civil service that we talk about everywhere. I think Brazil is one of the most extreme examples of that and how the civil service has traditionally operated. But I think Brazil, for me, is also, in the federal civil service in general, but in NAPI in particular, one of the best examples of creative thinking on how to try and reform that and put in place these kind of, like you said, transversal processes, matchmaking mechanisms, better allocations of talent. And I think, NAPI is such a dynamic and creative school of government, and it's just always inspirational to hear about all of the work that you're doing. And I think really being at the forefront worldwide of thinking about how we can change the way that things work in many of the similar ways that kind of Dustin and Thea pointed out that we need to move towards. So thanks for those comments. I have a couple questions for our panel, but I suspect that many of you do as well. We have the Q&A function there. So, you have these three incredibly smart and thoughtful people. Please do use them. So if you put questions in the Q&A, you might not see them pop up immediately, but we're collecting those, and I'll then pose those to the panel. So if it's a question about something that any of them has said, or any related issue that you want to pick their brains on, please do share those thoughts. Before we do that, I have a couple questions, and I also want to share with you the results of the poll that we started this session with. So the winner by a narrow margin was interventions to sustain and improve flexibility in organizational culture. And very close to that, as a second priority, was training on developing new leadership skills. And I think it's interesting as well that this was by no means a landslide, right? We have quite a few people reflecting that each of these are significant priorities, which says something about the breadth of the challenge that governments are facing. But I want to start off by asking about these questions of culture and leadership skills. So one of the challenges that people often reflect on in an age of remote and hybrid work is, how do you build organizational culture? How do you sustain it when people aren't there physically, when you don't have those water cooler chats, when many people working for the organization may never have been in the office, or are only there infrequently? And I want to try and combine this also with a question about developing new leadership skills. One of the other reflections that we've heard a lot over in our interviews and over the past couple of days is that the challenges and the transformations of the COVID period have required new modes of leadership and new styles of leadership, that leadership is not just about being the boss and telling people what to do. It's much more about delegation, about emotional skills and management, about differentiating leadership styles for different people. And I think that actually that question of how do we develop and support those type of new leadership skills that governments haven't traditionally been great at fostering to me seems very connected to the question of how do we build and sustain organizational culture more broadly when many people are not in the office. So that's a simple question then that I'm going to throw to our panel. Dustin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna have to kind of figure out our path forward on those big questions around leadership and organizational culture. It's really hard to come up with like, oh, this is the answer, right? It is going to take some time, I think, and to figure out. I'll just give you maybe my own personal example from our own team, which, you know, I think maybe not atypical from a traditional kind of team environment that we see playing out. We've set an expectation where we're going back 2 days a week into the office. And one of the things we decided as a team early on was we were going to have one of those 2 days that people are expected to be in the office be common. So that way we did have enough kind of people in the office at the same time that we could really try to be purposeful about taking advantage of that time to do some of the in-person activities that were going to be critical for maintaining that trust and that those relationships, and, you know, very importantly, new team members who hadn't been on the team before the pandemic and hadn't ever met people in 3 dimensions before, but just been on the Zoom meetings. So that is one of the ways that we've worked to try to find that balance. And I think one of the things, you know, I reflected on is being really intentional about my calendar on those days where we are in the office. And, you know, we're still in Zoom meetings, even when we're in the office. But can I create more white space on my calendar so that I have time to do some of the informal things that I think are absolutely critical, but just maybe we need to be a little more intentional about scheduling, and we're not scheduling, but making them happen versus, you know, when you're in the office 5 days a week, you know, you're there enough and it's going to naturally kind of happen. But when you only have maybe 1 or 2 days, you've got to really be intentional about it and prioritize it. And so I do think that is something that we're kind of working through. And I do think that's an important kind of leadership moment to recognize, you know, it's not just about the work, but really have to be extra intentional about building up that social capital and figuring out ways to do that for new team members in particular, so they feel part of the organization, they understand the norms, and can kind of integrate in more effectively. So I think that is something that just becomes even more important for leaders to prioritize and really be intentional about.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dustin. Thea, Diogo, any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to jump in. So I think, again, you know, what is required is a shift away from leadership as being seen as being about control. You know, good leaders are leaders who can control things. Again, like linking back to the concept of complexity. And there's some really powerful concepts around sort of, you know, system stewardship. So leaders as system stewards. There's also a great article, it's not that new anymore, in the SSIR about the concept of system leadership, and the idea that what systems leaders do is they shift the conditions through which others can learn to collectively make progress against the challenge. So it's less about sort of the leader as central, the leader as problem solver, and a shift towards seeing the role of the leader is to create conditions in which the people with whom they work, right from the executive right through to the front line, all feel empowered to collectively problem solve and collectively find their way through these complex challenges. So I think that, you know, there's some really interesting work around humble government that Demos Helsinki did. I think these concepts of humility and stewardship and systems leadership are really, really crucial. And I think actually an example of a leader who embodied that is a woman called Donna Hall from Wigan in the UK. So she was a local council chief executive, and she uses a phrase that I use a lot now because I think it's so powerful. And she said that as a leader, she was tight on values and loose on delivery. In other words, she was absolutely unmovable in terms of the value set that she created, but then gave huge flexibility to the people that she worked with right across the entire council to find their own way of realizing those values. And I think that idea of tight on values and loose on delivery is really critical.
Thanks, Thea. Your first example, when I asked you for an example, was so good. I want to do it again. And you talked about this idea of kind of system stewardship and humility, which I love as a kind of mode of leadership and thinking about that. Is there an example of a kind of intervention or change or process or behavior that you've seen that can help foster that among people who aren't used to that kind of leadership?
It's a great question. So the question that you're asking is what can it take to shift a person from a sort of more of a traditional command and control? I mean, it's a great question. And I think that my observation in all the leaders that I've seen who have done things like that, like Donna Hall, Olli Pekka Heinen from Finland, who was the head of the Department of Education there, who again took a really, really devolved approach and set up what he describes as sort of a learning culture, where the role of the central department was to learn from what teachers were doing on the ground and sort of then I guess share that learning across the system. And what Olli Pekka and Donna Hall and other leaders that I've encountered, Deirdre Mulkerrin, who's a leader here in Australia, what they all talk about is a deep sense of frustration with the fact that the current system is not working and it's not enabling them to achieve the results that they need. So for Donna Hall, that was, she was hit by austerity measures and needing to do impossible things with really, really tight budgets. And so she was just forced to do something drastically different. With Deirdre Mulkerrin, who works here in Australia in child protection, there were really, really poor outcomes for vulnerable children, and something radically needed to change. So I think it's almost like, sometimes it's people hitting the point of despair and thinking, well, the status quo just isn't working. I have to try something else that really shifts them into a different sort of mode. The other thing is, there is enormous courage required to deviate from traditional forms of leadership. And that's another thing that I've observed, that these people who I meet and am lucky enough to sort of work with and talk to use terms like, I proceed until apprehended, or I ask forgiveness, not permission. And so there is absolutely also a sort of a deep courage and conviction in what they do that is, a hard ask to put on everyone. So I acknowledge that this stuff is not easy.
Thanks, Thea. Diogo, any thoughts on this point about culture and leadership?
Sure. We have a report coming up with the OECD that we did a survey with schools of governments in different countries, seeing what are the main challenges that they face in terms of preparing the public sector for the future. And a lot of that has to do with high demand for new digital skills with a low offering in training and capacity building. So there's a lot that we need still to learn how to build that public sector for the future. In Brazil, we did a study detecting that between 20 to 25% of current roles in government will become obsolete by 2030, and also new roles will arise. So we're looking at a more augmented reality in public sector, or augmented public sector, a public sector which has leaders that are able to use these new digital tools to become more productive and to offer better services. And to create that, I think is still a challenge. There is a few tools that here at ANAP we've been experimenting with, like using language models such as GPT-3 to create new documents and to run analysis. We've also developed a bootcamp model. So in Brazil, there's this particularity. Every 5 years, public servants can take 3 months off to do training. And we try to offer a new model, a new experience for that, being very immersive. So we brought some bootcamp models from abroad, from Le Wagon in France, and now from Ironhack in the US, and try to reskill these workers in new digital skills. And the result has been, I think, quite amazing. It's still not as scalable as we would like to be, but to see public managers who now have new tools to deal with ancient problems is quite surprising, and to see how they become more used to having new digital skills to tackle issues that they are experts with, but they just didn't have the tool set, the toolkit to deal with that. And to just touch on one last point that Dustin mentioned, also how to make this hybrid format work. We've been trying to come up also with ways that make in-person work more meaningful, and try to work with our teams to make sure that you just don't come to the office and you sit in front of a screen and do a Zoom call with someone else, but you actually have very meaningful interactions and have certain moments with the different teams where people can get to know each other, and the onboarding for new public servants also become more fruitful and productive.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Diogo. And I love this point that you mentioned that Dustin also highlighted, that about intentionality. And I think that so many of the answers for how do you change culture, how do you change leadership skills aren't necessarily, the ideas or the interventions themselves aren't necessarily rocket science, but it's, being intentional about creating that environment, creating those interactions. So I think that's really useful. There's a question from I'm going to turn now to questions from the chat. So there's a question from Aaron Maniam, who is a senior civil servant in Singapore and also a newly minted Blavatnik School PhD. So congrats again on that, Aaron. So Aaron's question is with respect to Thea's reference on pastry making versus surfing. He says, we struggle in Singapore too with balancing ordered and unordered work. Any tips from the panel on how to get people trained, how to get people who are trained in pastry making, who value it and want to stick to it, to switch to surfing type environments? Thea, do you want to start us off on that one? And then Dustin and Diogo, if you have comments as well, we can take those.
Yeah, sure. So there's a great book called Seeing Like a State, which I'm sure a lot of people in this audience are familiar with. And in that book, Scott, who the author of the book, introduces the concept of legibility, which I just think is such a powerful concept. And to describe what legibility is, he gives an example of modern forestry practices. And he talks about the fact that forests hundreds of years ago acted as many things. They were places where people harvested wood and where locals went foraging, as well as an ecosystem for animals and plants. And then the people who wanted to create timber thought these forests would be much more valuable if we just focused on the timber. But to achieve that, these forests, which were sort of complex ecosystems, had to be made legible. So the modern agriculturalists clear-cut the forests, planted perfectly straight rows of fast-growing trees, and assumed that that would be more efficient, and that the quality of the timber would be predictable, the yield would be predictable. And it worked really well for about 100 years. It was really efficient and it produced a whole lot of really, really great timber. But after a century, what happened was it became apparent that the relationship, the invisible relationships, which we as humans had not appreciated, that existed between plants and animals and the root system, had been destroyed. And the delicate balance meant that the entire system actually collapsed because of the desire of the modern agriculturalists to make the illegible, what is necessarily illegible, legible. And the reason I refer to that, and I've actually written a blog on that and the way that concept of legibility plays out in government, is because I think that's the answer. What we tend to do is often delude ourselves into the pastry making paradigm. We convince ourselves that things can be made legible, that we can, if we just crunch enough data, if we just analyze enough and sort of plan enough, then we'll find the answer. But the reality is it just doesn't work. And so I think what needs to happen is the anomalies of that mindset just need to be called out again and again. And the alternative approaches need to be offered with more conviction and clarity as well. And that's really what we're trying to do at the Centre for Public Impact. We're trying to offer a sense of clarity around what an alternative approach looks like. What does it mean to embrace complexity? What does it mean to stop trying to make everything legible? Because it's not easy. It is uncomfortable. It does mean sitting with more discomfort. But in terms of encouraging people to shift from the pastry maker to the surfer, I think what needs to happen is that the anomalies of the current system, and this is what Donella Meadows talks about with paradigm shift as well, the anomalies of the current system need to be pointed out, and then the alternative needs to be offered in a way that feels meaningful and accessible.
Thanks, Thea. Diogo, Destin, thoughts on converting pastry makers into surfers?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. First of all, I'm heading out on vacation next week, and Thea has just given me my reading list for my holiday reading. So I really appreciate that. I'm taking furious notes on all of these excellent resources. So thank you, Thea. And our thinking could not be more aligned. One strategy that we have just started taking on, I know a few other governments have been maybe a little even further down this road, is one of my favorite books is Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and it's written for the private sector more, but I think there's so many lessons to be learned for government in terms of what really makes for a strong strategy that has a theory of change that gives you confidence is going to yield a good result. And one of the things that they talk about that is the best strategy takes an outside-in perspective. And I really think that's important. It takes an outside-in perspective. And I do not think that is often how we're conditioned in government to think. We take an inside-out perspective. We look at, things from kind of a top-down perspective often as leaders, the budget structure maybe, or, our top-down goals that get set in our strategic plans. And that's kind of like our orientation. And one of the things that we're doing in it is to shift our focus. Look at how government delivers from that citizen perspective. Look at somebody who has just been through a disaster, right? And how do they interact with government and all the different government agencies and programs that are designed to help somebody in disaster? What is that journey map, kind of, which is a tool we've employed, look like for them? What's that first interaction with government? What's that next form they have to fill out? Does that actually give them the answers they need to get back up on their feet, or are they kind of put through a labyrinth? I would really encourage folks to check out a resource, performance.gov/CX for customer experience. And you can see some of the results actually of our cross-agency journey maps that we've done for a number of different personas of people, not just theoretical, but real people that we're interviewing about their experiences navigating government, especially through some of those more complex life moments. We have actually just chosen 5 life experiences that we are standing up teams to work to optimize and change how those citizens interact with government. So I think that does kind of build on the conversation in terms of like, how do you get started? And I think that one of the things I've seen that's been very powerful is when you get started by listening to people's experiences with government, it is so sticky, right? People like gravitate to that because they are real stories about real people's lives, and they give you insights that you just don't get from talking kind of to more senior kind of leaders about how government works. And I really think having people, and this is actually something we're working on in OECD as well, what kind of skills do you need in government that help you move in this direction? And the thing that I've seen from my own team is the people who are coming in with human-centered design skills are amazing. And it is such a powerful and different way of looking at the role of government and how we can better organize ourselves. And that is not necessarily people with policy degrees like I have. It's a different way of operating, and I think we would do very well to kind of balance some of those people with policy and public administration and skills with some of those people that have facilitation, human-centered design type skill sets, and the balance of those two things can really be, I think, a really great way to begin a different way of working.
Thanks, Dustin. And I think this idea of building teams around life moments that citizens and service users experience is also a kind of fantastic way of thinking about how might one think about reordering internal hierarchies to respond to some of these kind of challenges. Diogo.
Yeah, I love so much what Dustin and Thea have said. It's even hard for me to compliment them, but I'm in Brasilia right now. That's our capital, and our capital is a city that I think has a lot to learn from what Dustin said, is how to design around people. And is also a chapter in the book that Thea has mentioned, Seeing Like a State. There's a chapter comparing Brasilia to Bruges and other cities. Brasilia is very, there's a lot of legibility from a very top-down level, but it's harder to organize from a bottom-up level as well. And I do think that one of the problems is that is a city that has a vision of the future, but a vision that's very static, right? And I think one of the things we need is visions that are very dynamic, which the core value is not stasis, technocratic stasis, but is learning and discovery, and that you allow that to happen. So that there is also a book I like a lot, and I've been referring to, which is The Future and Its Enemies by Virginia Pastro. And one of the examples that she uses to demonstrate her vision is the Epcot Center at Disney World, which was always a vision of the future, but that's always constantly changing because the vision of the future is always changing. And I think it's a very interesting balance that we need to have. We need to have a vision of the future. Sometimes we become optimists, but very in general terms, like, GDP is going to grow, or life expectancy is going to be higher tomorrow than today. But it's hard for us to see what that future will look like. But at the same time, you have to allow for that vision of the future to constantly change, to be upgraded, to be learned, and to be discovered. So when we look, for instance, at sustainability issues, I think a lot of the vision of the 20th century is that sustainability was a matter of control. And we have to make sure that some excesses of human actions don't harm the environment, which is completely legitimate. But now we see that it's also a matter of building and managing. We need to have better sources of energy. We need to build new solar or wind plants. And this is not just a role for controllers or for the judiciary, but it's also a role for the executive, for managers, for people who are building things. And I think that's a shift of vision. You have to learn how to build this new world, this new future. And it's interesting because there's always a vision of the future, a clean, lower carbon future. but that's always also allowing us to learn how to build and design these new projects. So I think this combination between having a vision of the future that it tries to be clear, but also tries to be open for dynamic changes is important for leadership in the public sector as ever.
Thank you, Diogo. We have some more questions, and I'm going to pair two questions that are, I think, also related. The first question comes from Maria Thompson Walters, who is the executive director of the Jamaican Transformation Implementation Unit in the government of Jamaica, and has contributed lots of thoughts and insights over the last couple of days as well. Her question is, in Jamaica, we had organizations that collaborated and coordinated because they needed to in order to deliver during the pandemic, as many times solutions needed cross-functional execution. Any thoughts on co-opting these types of activities for sustainability? And then there's a second question from Jason Fox, which is, what are the drivers, opportunities, and challenges related to the relationship between the political sphere and the public service sphere in terms of accountability, responsiveness, and transformation? So two questions, each one focused more on kind of cross-governmental coordination within government, one about kind of bureaucratic political relations, but I think quite related in what some of the challenges and perhaps solutions might be. Thoughts from any of the three of you on either of those questions?
Well, I'm happy to maybe kick it off. We've done a lot of work on developing new kind of governance capabilities that are designed to address those types of problems that are kind of cross-cutting in nature. We've stood up things kind of similar to something like a transformation management office that is focused on a specific kind of outcome or even process, to be honest, that is complex and requires multiple agencies to kind of work together. That is not, very well optimized. So take like our infrastructure permitting and environmental review process, 30 different agencies have to participate in that. And there has not historically been a central kind of group that is looking at the whole. Each agency kind of does its own piece, and that creates huge complexity and challenges for project proponents. It puts all of the burden and the complexity of government on them rather than us having an ability to simplify and frankly even monitor timelines and environmental review process. So we stood up a 20-person team that is now an independent agency, actually, with responsibility for looking at the whole of that process, and that has really helped, I think, provide, for instance, transparency into the process that we've never had before, and escalation paths to resolve issues, on a more timely and real-time basis. So I think that's one example of a capability that we're establishing. I would argue that, the traditional government answer to these sorts of things, which is to develop a committee or a working group that may meet like once a month, is really limited in its ability to kind of deliver transformational change. And you really need to create an opportunity, I think, for somebody to wake up every day feeling responsible for the horizontal. One of my favorite sayings is we have these horizontal problems, we have vertical organizations, and whose job is it to wake up every day feeling responsible for overcoming that? And that does take often, I think, additional capacity in the center of government. It just does. Issuing new requirements kind of onto systems that are already challenged is not going to be sufficient, or kind of working group meetings or committee meetings. You really need somebody who has enough expertise to be partnering and see themselves also as servant leaders. I couldn't agree more with Thea's point on that. In asking the question, how can we from the center kind of help those line kind of ministries and frontline folks by coordinating, by connecting, by collaborating more effectively. And we have done that in, I'd say, 3 or 4 different kind of mission areas. And I think the life experiences effort that I mentioned earlier is kind of trying to build on that. in other areas. Last thing I'd say on the partnering up, we do have something in our performance management framework that establishes goal teams. And oftentimes we have a goal leader who is a political appointee, but we also expect there to be a deputy kind of goal leader who is a career official. And so we've really tried to use that framework as a way of encouraging partnerships between your political appointee and your career leader. And then we put their photos up on our website, and when you track progress every quarter, and there's kind of a pretty good rhythm that's survived across 3 administrations now of setting those goals and monitoring progress, and really kind of having them take off their organizational hat and put on a goal leader hat with responsibility that's broader than maybe their traditional day-to-day area. So that actually I think is a good way of just architecting, again, the partnership that's expected between that political and career level.
Thanks, Dustin. That's really insightful. Thea or Diogo, you don't have to have answers to every question, but if you do, feel free to jump in. We also have a few others queued up, so feel free to take a pass, and we can move on as well if you want to get to other ones. But also, this is an incredibly interesting topic, so I don't want to preclude any thoughts you have on that.
I'll just share a really quick example from Australia, which was really interesting, that emerged from COVID. So we used to have we're a Commonwealth in Australia, so we have a Commonwealth government, and then each state and territory has its own government as well. And something that emerged from COVID was a national cabinet, and a governance institution that had never existed before, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. And then has the premiers and chief ministers from all states and territories coming together to meet and work collaboratively. And that is now being sustained beyond COVID. So I guess I'm just offering that as an interesting sort of institutional development that emerged to support more effective collaboration across jurisdictions here in Australia.
Than's Thea. Diogo, thoughts?
One example also from Brazil. The 2 chambers in Congress in Brazil, there's a lot of low-hanging fruits for them to improve scalability that they don't take. And during the pandemic, they realized that having 2 separate systems for process management that don't talk with one another wasn't practical. And this made them make them more aligned. And now it's easy to send process from Senate to the House of Representatives and vice versa. But in other areas, there's still this amazing division of labor and contracts and management. So if you come to Brazil and you go to Congress, you see that the lawn that surrounds the building where the 2 houses are centered, they have different contracts. So one side is contract by the Senate, the other one is contract by the House of Deputies. Same thing with the hallway that connects the two houses. 2/3 is from one chamber, 1/3 is from the other. And sometimes they have different waxing in the floor. One is glossier, the other is like matte. And you see that visual difference between the lack of coordination between them two. So during COVID, they actually came up and decided that they could unify some of those contracts. Not really unify them, but at least have a better management between them. But there's just some observations of the challenges that we're facing.
Thanks, Diogo. I love that example of how day to day and visible these kind of things can be. When we often think of them as abstract, but it's literally under our feet sometimes.
Yes.
So we've got 3 questions that are all related to kind of comparative questions in some way. So the first is from Oludare Adewale Ogunjobi, who says, I noticed that this research report does not reflect happenings in Africa. How can we bear their results to bear on African public organizations? And I'm not sure which research report it's referring to, but we can all reflect on that. There's a second question, which is from Amira Kasha Sumarto, who is also a doctoral student here at the Blavatnik School, who asks, can the approach of giving more autonomy and empowerment ever work in the case of bureaucracies with very low capacity? And so that might be the case both across country differences, but also within each country, of course, there are differing levels of capacity and effectiveness across different organizations. And then the third question is from Vera Montero, who's a professor at in Sao Paulo at Fundação Getúlio Vargas, who says, Thea mentioned the importance of the empowerment of frontline people. An important part of innovation in government comes from letting space to civil servants to make decisions and transform things. In Brazil, we have the feeling that the control system, because of the corruption cases, has a negative side effect on managers, that they become standstill because they're full of risk aversion and feel afraid of being wrongly penalized. Does this also happen in other countries? And do you know any data or research on this topic? So 3 questions, one on Africa, one on autonomy and empowerment in low capacity contexts, and one on kind of control mechanisms creating paralysis in the bureaucracy. I certainly have comments about these. I do research on all 3 areas, so there are 3 comments that are very dear to my heart. But let's start with the 3 of you for any very brief thoughts. And I say very brief because I've just realized that I got carried away and we have 2 minutes left. I got excited by the comments. So let's just do a quick round through. Dustin, do you want to take a quick stab at any of these?
Actually, I'll defer to others. I feel like I've gotten most of my points I wanted to kind of make. So given we're short on time, I'll go ahead and defer.
Creating space for others, good leadership. Thea.
Sure. So I will just address Vera's question, which is to say, absolutely, that happens in other countries. And Martin would be really interested in the research that you've seen, but the research that I've seen shows that essentially creating really strict KPIs and metrics leads to really perverse behaviours and leads to gaming and does not encourage the spirit of public service, which is ultimately what we want to be creating an environment, for public servants to sort of inhabit, I guess. So yes, I empathise with the challenge that you've described there and think that the research backs it up.
Thanks, Thea. Diogo.
Just touching on the low capacity challenge. We have this in Brazil. Brazil is very diverse, and we have over 5,000 municipalities that change from Sao Paulo, where Professor Vera Montero lives, with 20 million people, to small towns with less than 1,000 people, and they have the same structure by the Brazilian Constitution. They need to have the same political structure. But one thing that we've been trying to do is to have more technological transfer. So bringing mayors and secretaries to Brasilia to learn with the federal civil service, but also trying to have more exchange between different levels of government and different spheres of government, so we can have that kind of exchange format happening. Now we're working on norms that could allow that to happen, that we have civil servants from different levels of government that can work in other levels of government and trying to bring with them that kind of technological transfer. So it's something that we're trying here in Brazil.
Thanks, Diogo. I will take a quick stab at a couple of these. So on the first question from Oladare about trends in Africa as well. So in our Voices report, we did interview 2 senior leaders in African civil services, and I think the overwhelming feeling was of similarity of challenges and similarity of pressures and directions for reform. There were definitely some variations, and some of them you would expect related to kind of differing levels of infrastructure and connectivity and that kind of thing, which was a pattern across countries. Also differing previous levels of experience with telework. So countries which had prior telework policies in place, which weren't all rich countries. So Colombia is one of the countries which had a better telework policy in place than most OECD governments and did better with it when the pandemic hit. But actually, I think the thing that came through really strongly for us was how similar those challenges were. On Amira's question about cases of low capacity and does autonomy work there, there's a whole stream of research coming out in places like Nigeria, Ghana, Pakistan, Italy, where there are concerns around corruption, around levels of effectiveness, showing that actually giving greater levels of autonomy to bureaucrats, even in what might be thought of as challenging or on average low capacity kind of environments, seems to have positive effects. And so it's a common worry, but actually a lot of the research evidence says, there's probably scope for this even in more challenging, more environments which one might expect to be more low capacity. And then for Vera's question about corruption stifling or controls stifling innovation, I think in the next panel or to close us out, we have Chico Gaetani, who I know has thought a lot about these kind of issues. We here in the Blavatnik School are also working on writing a teaching case about this issue in Brazil and the apagao das canetas, or the blackout of the pens, as people call it there, because it is an issue that is so relevant around countries. And I think goes back to this question that I asked at the end of the panel about how is it that we can stop rules for pastry makers from preventing people from surfing? How do we manage that? And how do we think about that challenge going forward? So my apologies that we've overrun by a few minutes here. We're going to take a quick break now before we come back for the second panel. I'd suggest that so on the schedule, we said we were going to come back at 2:40 p.m. UK time, which is in just 7 minutes. I'm going to suggest that we take a 12-minute break so that we all come back a little bit more refreshed, and we'll start promptly at 2:45 p.m. UK time. Please join me in thanking our three panelists. This was a really wonderful session. I learned a lot. I hope it was useful for all of you, and apologies to everyone who submitted questions that we weren't able to get to. Thanks everyone, and see you in 12 minutes.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you, Diogo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margarita.
Hi, I'm Rita and Jean. Are you here? Hi, Jean.
Hi, Margarita. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you perfectly. Thank you.
How are you?
All good, all good. Thank you very much for joining. We have also Anrita here. Just give me 1 second.
Hey Margarita, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
This is because Fred is telling us to move to the breakout room so we can test the audio.
That's perfect. So just, how can I join the breakout room?
He just said, I cannot see it because I'm a host, but he says the button is located at the bottom of the screen. So it should be one of the options next to Q&A, interpretation, and something like that. Please let us know if that's the case, Fred. Okay, you're going to be moved, Margarita.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining the session 2 of this conference titled The Future of Work in the Public Service, Key Themes and Opportunities. To warm up the discussion, we are sharing a poll in the chat. That is, we are asking, it's an open question, and then we will share the results. We're asking you how governments can attract the best talent. And it will take just like a few minutes. You will have that in the chat already. Please just go to the link and you will go to the questions. Thank you. We'll just give you a couple of minutes. Thank you. So I think that now we can start the session 2, and I'm delighted to welcome our 2 amazing speakers of this session. They have a lot of experience working on remote work and the future of work, and also in job quality and well-being. Our first speaker today is Amrita Dakar. And Rita is a researcher at the Deloitte Center for Government Insights. She leads the future of work research at Deloitte, and she has more than 10 years working on digital transformation, future of work, innovation, and future trends in government. Our second speaker today is Professor In Su. She is the director of the very new research center called Future of Work at the University of Surrey. The center, she can tell us a little more about the work that they are doing, is working a lot about technology, skills, the challenges that the labor market is facing in terms of future of work. And she has been working on job quality and employee well-being in UK and Europe with a focus on public and private sector, in general in the labor market. And I think that Professor Jing is going to bring a very interesting perspective of the experience that she has been working on this in general in the labor market, and we might hear some interesting insights about how can we apply this or learn in the application of the public sector. To start the conversation, I would like to highlight some of the main insights of the discussion that we have had with policymakers and scholars during the last 2 days, and also some of the main insights of the research that we have done focus on the remote world, but that is very connected with the broader agenda of the future of work. And the first insight that I want to highlight is that the new ways of working have demand new managerial practices in public organizations. And the first one that we have been discussing through these sessions is like we now are looking to have leadership that is more flexible, that is more agile. And when we are talking about working in a remote or hybrid scheme, that a leadership that is a leader that is able to manage a diverse group of people in a diverse way. And that is putting a lot of challenges to public organizations in terms of moving from a more traditional way of leadership to a new type of leaders. The second finding that we had, and the second insight about how these new ways of working have changed the managerial practices is like, now there is a need of a system thinking approach. We need to think not just in silos or what is the goal of each agency, but how can we collaborate all these agencies together. And the third finding or interesting insight about these new managerial practices is a bigger emphasis on communication and feedback that is timely, that is also clear. The second like a finding that we had is like these new ways of working require changes, not just in processes, in legal frameworks, in rules, and in technology, but mainly in a mindset. Like we need to change the mindset of public employees, leaders, employees in different levels of the hierarchy in order to adopt these changes in the ways of working. I think that one of the the key questions that have came out in the discussions is that how can we adopt and how can we institutionalize these changes? And finally, one of the topics that came out from the discussions that we have is the importance of trust. How can we build trust in organizations? And this is in public organizations and in every organizations for sure. Will tell us a little more about this. How can we build trust inside of the public organization? This is not a new topic, but it's becoming more salient when we are not sharing the same space and also informally communicating a lot of practices and a lot of common understanding on how to work. And finally, and I think that also this is a topic that Professor In has been working a lot, is public leaders and public organizations are talking more about the public employees' well-being and public employees' mental health. And that is taking us to think about job quality, about also the environment in the public organizations that we haven't been thinking a lot. And without further introduction from the points and from the discussion that we have had, I will invite first Amrita Dakar to share some of the findings of the research that you have been doing. Amrita, you have been working a lot on the future of work, about which aspect of the remote work will remain and why. And how can governments and public organizations can institutionalize, formally or informally, these changes? And Rita, thank you very much to be here.
Thank you, Margarita. Pleasure to be here, everyone, and to really participate in this conference. It took a pandemic and the forced shift to remote work to really shake society out of norms that we have followed for over a century now. And because of this revolution, we have the rare opportunity to really intentionally remake how we approach our work systems to serve everyone better. Despite its challenges, I do think remote work is here to stay, and we will continue to see a more intentional recalibration of how workers split their time between physical offices and remote environments going forward. But one of the dimensions of remote work that I think will continue into the future is flexibility across dimensions. So flexibility, not just in terms of where work gets done, but also how and when. The notion of asynchronous work has really been a game changer and has enabled employees to really find balance between their personal commitments and professional demands, and just recognizing that not everyone is productive on the exact same schedule, and agencies and work can get done through asynchronous work as well. Many government agencies have also moved to a digital-first way of working, meaning that where work gets done is less important than how it's done. Sometimes decisions on where a particular task should be performed is actually determined by where individuals are most productive doing that particular task. So, for example, brainstorming activities in the office and more focused work in a remote environment. I think the benefits of this approach extend to things like staffing and skills as well. So government agencies are not constrained by geography when they're making decisions about staffing assignments or hiring, or even rolling out professional development and training programs for employees more widely as a result of the virtual environments that we have. A good example of this is NASA, that actually started a virtual internship program at the beginning of the pandemic, and they continue to have that even today. As far as institutionalizing and managerial practices go, I think hybrid work really calls for moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach. But at the same time, there really has to be more structure and some guardrails around it to make it successful. There are two areas that I'd like to call out where I think managerial practices are necessary. Firstly, equity and inclusion. So data suggests that certain portions of the workforce, for example, women and new employees, are disproportionately affected by the challenges associated with remote work. So things like increased stress, isolation, meeting fatigue. At the same time, with hybrid work, there's also concerns that a hybrid setup can lead to the creation of a two-tiered workforce. So the employees who work primarily from home might be at a disadvantage because they miss out on career development or networking opportunities compared to their peers in the office. Organizations have a number of ways to tackle some of these inequities. The simplest thing could be to just have more inclusive meetings. So everyone joins in virtually regardless of their physical location, as well as more structured things like having training for managers and supervisors on proximity bias. But regardless of the measure, I think what's really needed here is to institutionalize it and make it formal through organizational policies and really help those measures scale across the organization. The second point I want to highlight here is around culture and connection. So research from the Yale School of Management shows that during the course of the pandemic, our personal and professional social networks actually shrunk by 16%. And if we really think back to the early days when remote work had just started, one of the reasons it could be successful was because of the pre-existing social networks and connections that employees had within their organizations. Now, as we move to a hybrid setup, it's imperative that we sort of invest in rebuilding some of those networks and enable employees to forge meaningful connections in the workplace. And I think this is really essential for any organization to thrive. And that's another area where managerial practices and intervention are key to sort of formalize the mechanisms by which workers can connect with one another and really forge meaningful connections in the workplace. I'll stop there. Thanks, Margarita.
Thank you very much, Amrita. I think that, yeah, you highlight very, very interesting points. For example, the importance of focus on equity and inclusion. In the research that we did, we found that newcomers were facing the biggest challenges when we were working remotely. And the reason of this might be, and as you highlight, is that for these new workers, the network that they are creating at the starting of their career is very crucial for the future development. I think that I don't know if you want to share a little more about any practices, any like examples about how, in the research that you have been doing, how public organizations are trying to tackle these groups that might be left behind.
So in terms of groups that might be left behind, just from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, I think an important thing that organizations can do is just really focusing on creating a sense of belonging. So when a new person joins, having a network for them that they can organically and naturally just become a part of. So sometimes onboarding happens in cohorts, and helping new hires connect with the people that they are joining with, but also giving them an onboarding buddy, for example, having deliberate and planned networking events specific for new hires so they can start forming those networks that they need to be successful in their roles. I think the key word here is intention. A lot of things just happened naturally when all of us were in our offices and working side by side. But now that part of our workforce is virtual, part of our workforce is in the office, things need to be done a lot more deliberately. It doesn't seem as obvious, but sometimes making room for those intentional interactions can really be critical in making a new person feel welcome in the organization and giving them the resources to really do their job well.
Thank you, Amrita. Now I would like to invite Professor Insu to share some of her thoughts. As I mentioned, Professor Insu, she has been doing a lot of research on job quality and public employees' well-being from a broader perspective. I think that what you can bring to the discussion, Jean, is to try, like, what can we learn from the research that you have been doing, and how can we also understand better where do we go in order of job quality and how to provide well-being to public employees. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you for the introduction, Margarita. It's a pleasure for me to join this panel. Today, I will talk about how job quality has changed in the UK over the last 3 decades. It's notoriously difficult to predict what's going to happen in the future, but we can look at what happened in the past. Sometimes that can give us a hint on what might happen in the future. There's a long tradition of research on job quality. Job quality is a multidimensional concept, which includes a wide range of benefits that people can obtain from their work. Economists have traditionally focused on pay, and sociologists and psychologists have focused more on non-financial aspects of job quality, such as skills, job autonomy, and work-life balance. In 2017, the UK government published the Taylor Review, which suggests that good work must be defined more broadly than pay. Apart from offering decent wages, good work must also offer realistic scope for personal development and fulfillment. So following that call, we created an index to measure overall job quality. We call that the Good Work Index. It includes 9 specific indicators of job quality. It covers not only extrinsic job quality, such as pay and job security, but also intrinsic job quality, such as task variety, job autonomy, and the opportunity to use and develop your skills. We use data from the UK Skill and Employment Survey, which is the best job quality survey in this country. It interviewed nearly 30,000 workers in the UK over the last 30 years. What we found was that there is a general positive correlation between pay and overall job quality. So the higher your pay, the better your overall job quality. But there are also interesting exceptions. There are a handful of occupations where people are paid reasonably highly, reasonably good, but they enjoy lower overall job quality. We did something quite interesting here. We first ranked all occupations according to their average pay, and then we ranked all occupations according to their overall job quality. And we took the difference of these 2 ranks to see where lies the largest discrepancies. We found at the top of the list is aircraft pilots. So if you look at aircraft pilots, they are better paid than 84% of all employees. But their overall job quality is only better than 41% of all employees. So other occupations which are paid better than their overall job quality include IT professionals, lawyers, and finance professionals. At the opposite end, we also found some occupations which are relatively low paid, but people enjoy higher overall job quality. An example is beauticians. If we take beauticians as an example, they are paid only better than 12% of all employees in the UK, but their overall job quality is better than nearly 70% of all workers. That's a very stark contrast. Other occupations like hairdressers are people like beauticians, hairdressers, clergy, bakers, and playgroup leaders. So this exercise shows that pay and overall job quality do not always go hand in hand. Next, we look at what happened to job quality over the last 30 years. Here, there's a literature that argues the labor market has become more polarized over time. This is because it's difficult for technologies to replace highly skilled jobs, which require creative and interpersonal skills. But it's also difficult for technologies to replace low-skilled physical labor, such as stacking supermarket shelves. What is most vulnerable to automation are the middle-paying jobs, such as routine office work. A lot of these jobs follow well-defined routines, which can be taken over by algorithms quite easily. So when the middle paying jobs are replaced by technologies at a faster rate, this results in a hollowing out of the occupational structure. So that research is purely based on pay. We wonder whether the same can be said for overall job quality. And then we look at what happened to job quality over the last 3 decades. What we found was quite different from what happened to pay. Actually, there's no evidence of polarization of the labor market. We found there has been a steady decline in lower quality occupations and a steady increase in higher quality occupations. It's a picture of general upgrading. Then we wondered whether these trends are likely to continue into the future. Here we plotted the correlation between job quality and probability of automation. The probability of automation scores are taken from UK ONS. We found there's an inverse relationship between automation potential and job quality. So whether you define job quality by pay or by overall job quality, the picture is consistent. It's the low paid and low quality jobs which are most likely to be automated, while highly paid and higher quality jobs are least likely to be automated. So it seems quite likely that occupational structure will continue to evolve in favorable ways. The good jobs will probably continue to expand, and the bad jobs will probably continue to shrink. So to summarize, we have 2 key findings. Our first key finding is that there is a general positive correlation between pay and overall job quality, but there are interesting exceptions. There are people such as beauticians and hairdressers who are not paid great, but they enjoy pretty high job quality. And there are also people such as pilots, lawyers, and finance professionals who are highly paid, but enjoy less great job quality. So pay and quality of working life do not always go hand in hand. Our second key finding is that job quality has generally improved in UK over the last 3 decades. And automation probability is inversely related to job quality. This is a rather important message because if artificial intelligence technologies are most likely to take away the least satisfying jobs, that means we are probably heading towards a better future. But that doesn't mean everybody will benefit from these trends. What will happen to people who lose their jobs in shrinking occupations? Will they be able to find jobs in growing new occupations? And what can we do to support people to acquire the skills which are necessary for transitioning into those higher quality occupations? These are big questions facing researchers and policymakers in the coming decades. Thanks.
Thank you, Ying. I think that very interesting points about like how a good quality of job or job quality is not just defined by economic incentive or extrinsic incentives, but also about intrinsic incentive, and connecting your research with the public service. I think that this is very important. No, like when we think about the importance of this intrinsic motivation and what can make people to feel more engaged with their job, happier with their job, and I think that that's very interesting. I would like to go back to Amrita and ask her a little more about like what are the talking about like remote work and the challenges that we have seen on for example female gender difference on adopting the new ways of working. What is your research telling us about the inclusion of women in these new practices and new ways of working?
Yes, so I think there has been widespread research and data showing that since the pandemic began, a large number of women actually left the workforce and are yet to return to the workforce, primarily because they were, sometimes childbearing responsibilities or caretaking responsibilities fell upon them, and they simply did not have the same support as maybe their male colleagues did. But with respect to women in the workforce and how remote work can now support them, I think it's important to recognize that they do experience things like Zoom fatigue or meeting fatigue differently than, and probably to a greater extent than their male colleagues. And just making sure that in a remote environment, those sensitivities are taken into account and more inclusive practices are made. So, for example, the pressure of appearing on camera is experienced perhaps differently by men and women. So having certain meetings that are video-free meetings can take some of the pressure off. It's a very simple thing to do, but it can also make a difference, right? Or sometimes women are disproportionately affected, like I said, by caretaking responsibilities. So they might have a small child at home, their home might be a little messy. So again, having options where you can turn off the video, or having flexibility in schedules that can help them balance some of those concerns can really make a difference in making them feel more included in the workforce and making them able to do their best work.
Thank you, Rita. In your research, do you see any difference between gender, ages, about job quality? This is something that we have been discussing a lot in the last days in the conversations that we had, and one of the questions that we had in the previous session was about if, like, we need to implement different policies when we are talking about adopting these new ways of working or improving the quality of job. Do we need to think about different interventions and policy regarding considering age, considering gender? What is your research telling us about these socio-demographic differences?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Margarita. We didn't find huge gender differences. Actually, women and men have pretty similar quality jobs. In the past, a really interesting finding from this area of research shows women have higher average job satisfaction than men. But if you look at their objective job quality, it's no way better than men's job. This probably has something to do with their expectations or personal value preferences. But on the whole, gender is not a big dividing line, but we do see big differences by age. Young people have on average much lower job quality scores than middle-aged or older employees. Probably because they are particularly heavily concentrated in certain types of jobs like retail, hospitality. So those jobs are pretty low on job quality measure. In terms of how to improve job quality, our findings show intrinsic job quality is the key. Actually, if you look at employee well-being and job satisfaction, pay matters much less than intrinsic job quality in terms of the opportunity to use and develop your skills, the opportunity to exercise control over what you are able to do. So autonomy, task variety, and skill opportunities, skill development opportunities are really key for job quality and well-being. Interestingly, pay is actually ranking quite lower on that list. We have a total of 9 indicators of job quality. We want to see which one are the most salient drivers of overall job quality and well-being, and it's mainly the intrinsic ones.
Jim, let me just follow up on that, because I think that that's very interesting, and I think that for our audience it will be also very interesting. One of the topics that have came out from the discussion, there are, like you just point out them. One is well-being. How can we improve well-being of public employees? What are the house, no? How can we put in practice the increasing well-being? And the second is autonomy. And in public organizations, we have always this tension between controlling and autonomy. I think that the new ways of working, the remote work has make an impetus and have put push public organizations to move to a more less control, giving more autonomy to public employees, and also having more inclusive decision making. So I think I really would like to hear from you. What can we do with to create more autonomy? No,
that's a great question, and a question I love, because my research is specifically focused on autonomy and employee involvement in organizational decisions. Actually, I recently wrote a report for Eurofund. Eurofund is EU's main research agency on working conditions. I did a report together with Duncan Galley, Professor Duncan Galley, who retired from Oxford University a few years ago. We are looking at autonomy and employees' wider organizational involvement in 28 European countries, comparing the differences across countries and their impact on well-being and skill development. You are absolutely right. Autonomy is hugely important. Actually, we have two dimensions of autonomy. The first one is called task discretion. This is how much control you over your immediate job tasks. The second dimension is organizational involvement. So this is relating to your influence over wider organizational issues that goes beyond your immediate job. So both are very important. And if you look at European countries, the Scandinavian countries do best on those measures. More than half of employees in Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, they are working in high involvement organizations. But the pattern is much less favorable in continental Europe and particularly in South and Southeast Europe. And when people work in high involvement organizations, they do much better on skill development. Their mental health is better. They enjoy higher trust with their supervisors. And just across the board, everything is better when people are involved in decision-making in organizations. How does it happen? I think intention, like what Amita said earlier, this doesn't happen automatically. You need to make conscious effort to change. You need to train managers to develop a different mindset, not only to show them research evidence, say this works in other countries and has been working for decades and decades, but also like share best practices, how to make it happen and let them see the results. First-hand information always helps. So that can be done, but it takes careful planning and a lot of hard work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Rita, do you want to add any additional thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, of course. And I think Ying brought forward a very important point about belonging and autonomy. So I think autonomy particularly is one of those things that when we look at the future of work and we look at flexibility not just in where work is done, but also how. And that autonomy becomes a big part of the how. So really thinking about the choice and the freedom that employees are given in how they manage their own work. And also this goes back to the asynchronous part, which is managing your work at your own schedule. I think that freedom and control can give workers really a sense of ownership over their work and actually boost engagement levels. There has been research to show that autonomy can boost engagement in work as well. So yeah, I totally agree with Ying's point.
I guess practically, you can start judging people by their results rather than presence. You know, during the pandemic, a lot of companies bought electronic surveillance softwares. Sometimes they take photos of your computer screens and they count how often you use your keyboard. Those are really counterproductive. That sends a clear message that your employees cannot be trusted. It's much better if you monitor their performance and judge them by results. Agree on targets and see whether they meet their targets. Leave them to decide when and where and how to do their work. That's much less demoralizing. And that will encourage people to take responsible autonomy. That's better for individuals and employers.
This is taking us to another interesting topic that was raised in the conversations. That is one of the participants in the first session that we had, heads of civil service, said we need to rethink the system, the evaluation system, and the performance management. And the idea is like, how can we move from the KPI perspective or approach to a more result approach, where we don't need to see people in the office, we are focusing more on achieving specific results. Any inputs from this? Maybe I see you nodding.
I can take my personal example. As a university professor, we are always evaluated by results. They look at what publications you have got. The quality of research is pretty obvious. You can read the paper and see what is good. And for teaching, we are evaluated by students. So they don't have to watch me giving a lecture, but they can ask students how well I did in my lectures. I think a lot of government employees are probably, they can probably evaluate by results of their work. Similarly, you don't really have to watch them doing their work, because a lot of government employees are knowledge workers. Right? Knowledge is inside your head. You can't see how hard somebody's brain is working, but you can look at the work they produce. If you are given a report to write, did you deliver that report on time and according to the quality standard expected? So that's an example. And you should let people decide when they want to write that report, how they want to do it. As long as they deliver good quality work, that's what counts.
Rita, any insights about this? You have done a lot of research on this and rethinking. When we talk about future of work, we need to rethink the way that we monitor, that we evaluate public employees. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. And I think this boils down to just the way things have been done before, right? Sometimes it's a continuation of past practices. And it really takes, at a fundamental level, a mindset and culture shift. And sometimes that has to be leading by example. It could be, leadership deciding that this is the new way that we're going to work, and leading by example, really making sure that it is a culture change that takes place across the organization, across levels. And again, it has to be a very intentional effort. It has to be communicated widely for these things to really take root in a very organic way. But I don't think moving to this new approach can happen without culture change, without a fundamental mind shift in terms of we are going to now evaluate people by outputs and not inputs, right?
Just gonna follow up on that, because we had a very interesting discussion on this topic yesterday about the organizational culture. Where do we start? What organizational culture means in practice? Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Sure. Organizational culture is, I read this quote somewhere, that organizational culture is how people behave when no one is looking. So basically, it's how what workers understand that they are to conduct themselves when nobody's enforcing those rules for them. Is it, so do I work diligently the 8 hours when I'm virtual, or do I take a break to go, walk my dog? Or do I, work on a deliverable for some time and then slack off during the day and then miss my deadlines? And is that okay? All those things are often determined by culture. And I think that especially in a remote or a virtual environment, one of the things that organizations are losing is the sense of culture, because culture is sometimes reinforced when leaders talk about how things should be, when people interact with each other in person and see each other working. That's how culture is built. Culture is built through experiences and relationships. And a lot of that is getting lost in a purely virtual way of working. So again, it comes back to the point of intentionally deciding what our hybrid or future of work culture should be, and communicating that across all levels of the organization, whether it's, and I can give an example. So during the pandemic, the Department of Homeland Security, obviously employees were working remotely. There was a lot of stress, and their Chief Human Capital Officer, Angie Bailey, would send out personal emails. She started sending emails to the entire organization, just leadership updates about how things are going, what they're planning, how they plan to support their employees. And she would get responses, and she would actually reply. Now that, hearing firsthand from a leader when you respond to their email, can really make a difference to an employee in terms of feeling supported, feeling heard. And it's actions like that that can determine the culture of your organization. It comes from action and not just words.
Thank you. And Rita, do you want to share something regarding organizational culture?
Absolutely. I really like Rita's definition of organizational culture, this is what people do when they are not being watched. I think it's related to the shared norms, how things should be done. And I also agree with her about the importance of interpersonal interactions. So culture is developed through regular interactions. And interactions can be a big problem when people are doing a lot of remote working. When you're working from home, most of the time, it's difficult to see other people on a regular basis. And interpersonal interaction is not only important for culture, mental health, cohesiveness, it's also quite important for innovation. I once read a book about a leading university in the United States. There's a building that holds many academic departments. There's a long corridor in that building that everybody have to use when they go to lunch or grab a coffee. So people meet naturally in that corridor and they stop to chat to one another. So that resulted in a lot of interdisciplinary collaborations and led to some of the most important scientific breakthroughs. So this can be a problem when people work in isolation. How do we keep encouraging interpersonal collaboration when people are doing remote working or hybrid working? This will be a big challenge for the future.
And I think that this is taking us to another set, and then I'm gonna go open to the Q&A from the public. There are some challenges. No, there are some challenges that and also like maybe not very good things that could bring the remote work, the hybrid scheme, and I think that some of them might be very related with one of the points that you were raising at the beginning about the intrinsic motivation and this non-tangible things that we can get from our the job space, the interaction that we have with others, and the relationship and what we learn from our managers when we see, like even in informal settings. Now, would you like to add anything else related with this?
Yes, intrinsic rewards really includes good relationships with your managers and colleagues. That's very motivating and probably particularly important for women, also important for men, but women value relationships a lot. And there's an interesting result from my research co-authored with Mark Williams and Min Zhu. We compared occupations in terms of employee happiness and well-being, and we found hairdressers are among the happiest employees. Almost 90% of hairdressers are happy. And if you look at bus drivers, over 70% are not happy. But bus drivers on average are paid much higher than hairdressers. I suppose it has a lot to do with intrinsic job quality. Hairdressers have greater autonomy over the way they work. They have relationship dimension. Like when you are driving a bus, you can't speak to anybody on the bus. You are basically doing the job alone. But hairdressers are quite chatty. So there are a lot of intrinsic job quality dimensions which are really important for well-being and mental health, and probably quite overlooked in current job design efforts. We don't pay enough attention to intrinsic job qualities. Last winter in UK, we had this huge crisis with truck drivers. If you remember, how many of us had to queue for hours at petrol station to fill up our car? And they were really paying huge salary to attract truck drivers, but they were still not getting enough supply. So this tells you pay is only one of the things people consider. There are also other important dimensions of job quality, and that needs to be right.
Thank you, Ying. And Rita, do you want to add?
Yes, and I think specific to the public sector, one of the qualities for intrinsic job quality would probably be purpose. Knowing that your job makes a difference to the lives of others, I think is a great intrinsic motivator, and it's one that almost all public sector employees share. I think government agencies, though, can probably do more to communicate the impact that that the work of public sector employees has. So I'll give you an example. Health and Human Services caseworkers or social workers in the US, they found that when they would use dashboards to really show, they handle a lot of cases, and sometimes you don't necessarily know what the outcome of that is. But when you have a dashboard to really show what the outcome of each and every case that you handled was, and you can see those successes. You can see all the people you helped. Showing those kind of snapshots and summaries can really make a difference in employees feeling good about their work and feeling like they are making a difference in people's lives, which they are.
Yeah. Thank you, Enrita. I'm gonna ask some questions from the audience, and the first one I think that is very interesting, and I think that this is coming out all the time about how can we prevent autonomy and teleworking from degenerating to free riding or loafing.
I think judging by results, you need to hold people to account. If they agree to deliver a piece of work by a certain time, they need to do it. So you don't need to watch them by using your web cameras, but you do need to get the deliverable on time and of reasonable quality. So that will encourage people to take responsibility for managing their own productivity. They know they have something to deliver, so they wouldn't shirk. They wouldn't go to a gym or walk dog during the day if they can't get it done.
Rita, do you want to share?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's about flexibility, but with some guardrails, with some bounds around that. So obviously, if the expectation is that your performance will be judged by the output you produce, then automatically, I think people will make sure that the output they produce is quality because they're being judged for it. But making sure that that expectation is clear and communicated right from the beginning, so there's no scope for people to free ride or waste time during work hours, I think will be critical.
Yeah, my colleague Martin Williams was sharing in the first panel that it's not about not having rules or not having processes. No, it's like having like clear processes and but like in this more flexible context and share rules. No, like it's not now everything is is flexible and no rules, but it's like how can we build these new processes in this new environment. We have here a great question from Aaron. Aaron is from the Singapore government, and he said that they have found that the best reasons to bring people back to the office is to work on complex problems, as one of our previous speakers was highlighting, or a relationship building. Are there any other reasons or strong reasons to bring people back to the office, in your opinion?
Okay, I'll make a start. I think relationship building is important for several reasons. It's good for performance, like Aaron said, you get people together to solve complex problems. A lot of problems are probably so complex nowadays that it's beyond one individual's capability. So you bring people together, that's good for productivity and performance and innovation. It's also good for mental health. We know that if you're working on your own all the time, it's very lonely. Even for an introvert, it's probably too much to spend all your 5 days working from home. So people will want to go back to office and meet other people from time to time. But probably managers could do a little bit coordination, like schedule people's return day so that they are there on the same days of the week rather than different days. So when you go into office, you actually see other people.
Thank you. And Rita?
Yeah, I'd say that sometimes the reason to go back into the office is just for the infrastructure. Sometimes if you have an important presentation or a meeting where you need the tools and technologies that are exclusively available in your office facilities, and there are some, everyone's home office is not as functional necessarily as the physical office. So going to work, using those facilities, and I think we're moving more to an age where flexibility is also about going to the office for a few hours, then going and working out of a cafe because it's nearby and you're having your lunch, and then going home and working some more. So working across locations. And I think organizations are also building that into their physical infrastructure by creating different types of meeting rooms and desks and facilities to really support different types of interactions. So I know, for example, the LinkedIn office recently, there was a video about how they've revamped their entire office space to support multiple types of interactions. And it was supposed to be an office with little desks and cubicles, but now it's sort of different types of arrangements everywhere. You have little meeting rooms for people to get together. You have spaces where somebody can work in isolation for concentration. We also have to stop thinking of the office as a place where it's all about collaboration. For some people, going to the office can also be a great place to go and focus alone, away from the distractions of home, depending on your setup.
There is a question in the chat that about what does the future of work look for people with disabilities in the context of teleworking in the public sector? Do you have any thoughts on this? How can we consider people with disabilities and include them in this new way of work?
I think it's probably actually good for hybrid working offers more opportunities for a more inclusive work environment. People who are traditionally not able to go to a physical workplace can work remotely if they are offered the opportunity. An example is people with physical disabilities. If they are able to do the work from their home on a computer, probably the disabilities is less of an obstacle. And there has already been some research showing remote working has helped improve diversity and inclusion. For example, women with small children who are traditionally not able to travel into city center to work from an office building now can work from home. So that should be encouraging a more diverse labor force.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I don't have much more to add there. Being covered.
We have another question here about it's from a research analyst at the Canada Border Services Agency at the federal government of Canada. She would like to get a little more information and to get some of your thoughts about beyond just the pressure of governments and organizations to adopt increasingly hybrid work models, continued progress in technological innovation will influence the future of labor policy and quality of work for people from all walks of life across the world. Is there any specific differences between the public sector and the private sector? Can we see any difference about the technological adoption that will influence the future of labor market across the world?
My research has been based on the whole labor market data. So we include private and public sector, but I haven't done a lot of explicit comparisons between the sectors. I think some research has found that the effectiveness of hybrid working can differ depending on the nature of work. So some kind of job tasks are more suited to remote working than others. If I take my job, for example, I found I'm more productive if I do research from home because there are fewer interruptions. I can concentrate better. But teaching is different. I found teaching on Zoom is really a lot less effective than teaching in a classroom. The dynamic, the momentum is simply not there. And many of my colleagues have similar experience. So I think it probably not necessarily different between public and private sector, but depends more on the nature of your job tasks.
Thank you. Enrique, do you want to add any? No. One of the findings that we had in our research is like one of the biggest challenges that public employees working in remotely face was the work-life balance. And we have here one question coming from Mario Wortman from Brazil, and he's saying there are risks that we need to consider when we are talking about remote work. And he is saying that, for example, the family environment, the home environment that will be there, how can we find this balance and how can we reduce the potential risks that we can face while working remotely? And I would like to frame these questions more about what are the risks that you see and that you have found in your research related with the remote work, and maybe in more broad broadly in your research about the risk of working remotely, and how can we prevent those risks?
I'm happy to make a start there. I think one of the most salient risks is overworking. We all know there has been a blur of the boundary between home and work. When you use your home as your workstation, it happens so easily that you work into the evenings, on weekends, without even realizing it. Some research has already found remote workers on average work much longer hours than office-based workers. Some study found they are as much as 50% sometimes. So there has been a call for the right to disconnect, or the right to not respond to work emails outside working hours. So that is a potential risk or downside of remote working. It really intensifies and lengthens your workday. And as you said, whether your home environment is right for remote working is also important. Do you have a separate room for remote working, or do you have to compete for the same space with other family members? Do you have broadband, which is fast enough for Zoom meetings and calls? So these are practical issues that also need to be sorted out for successful remote working.
Thanks, Ying. And Rita, please.
Yeah, I agree with all of Ying's points. She covered that really well. I would just add that, again, reiterating the point of flexibility with boundaries, but in this case, the boundaries need to protect the workers. So really making sure that if people are opting for flexible hours and working above and beyond, that they're not getting overworked, that they're not getting stressed. A lot of things that one of the things people do now is put in their email signature, I work flexible hours. Just because I send you an email, you're not obligated to respond. It's a very small gesture, but at the same time, if you get that from your manager or supervisor, you will feel a little bit more relaxed in not replying to their email immediately or after hours. So it's again, it comes down to sort of culture and making those boundaries and expectations clear, that it's okay to, not work extra, or it's okay to define your boundaries even when you're working from home.
Thank you, Rita. And we have here a final question from the audience that is regarding about the hybrid working culture. I think the question is coming from Olive, and he say that it will improve the quality of life with regards to culture, because not everyone can find the job with a great culture they want. The semi-separation from the work culture during hybrid working is good in a way. So in our conversation, we said we are missing these interactions, informal interactions in the hall, as you were saying, in the building, that can improve interdisciplinary. But Olive brings another question that is another comment that is, also, it could be good for some type of people, and he's asking if there is any survey related with people's view on this, like having these less interactions in the office also for some people could work well in certain way. Any comments, Amrita?
I don't know that there's a survey that looks into that, but I do agree, and which is the great part about hybrid work. You can use it the way it works for you. So if you prefer being in the office and that's where you're most productive, work from the office. If you're more productive from home, work from home. So the decision whether to work in the office or from home or remotely should depend on where the individual worker is most productive, depending on the task that they're doing. I think that's a good way of looking at it.
There's an interesting study by Professor Alan Felstad from Cardiff University. He's a leading expert on remote working in UK. He has been doing this for over 25 years, actually. And I think Alan looked at the impact of remote working on productivity. And on the whole, using national representative data, he found it doesn't hurt productivity. Most people said it didn't make any difference. They get as much done from home as they do from office. Some people became more productive, some became less productive, but the proportions are pretty similar. So for the average worker, remote working doesn't affect productivity. What's also interesting in his finding is that people who said they were less productive when they work from home showed a stronger desire to return to office. And people who are more productive at home want to continue to work from home. So people know actually what works best for them, and they will self-select into the work patterns that suit them the best. this is consistent with Amita's point. People should have the freedom to decide what works best for them, and they can choose to work from office if it works for them.
Hello, thank you. There is just, and we are just closing, close to close this session. One additional question that was just posted in the Q&A, and it's related, and this was a question that we had today about older employees and how they are experiencing teleworking in the public sectors, and what are the challenges that they are facing, and related with technological skills. No, are they adapting and adopting these skills, and if there are any policies or interventions that governments are doing to try to tackle these potential challenges. And Rita, do you want to share something?
I would say that with respect to technology, especially, if we look back at when the pandemic really started and overnight everybody was working remotely, it became really essential to sort of document everything and have resources available for employees. So if they're working from different locations or they're working at different times, they can still continue to get their work done seamlessly. And as a result of that, I think we saw the creation of a lot of tutorial videos, how-to documents, guides, like the number of guides I've seen on how to get Zoom started and how to be an effective presenter, and even more so at the beginning when remote work had just started. All these resources, I think, and training maybe for older employees or those who struggle with the technology, I think are ways that this issue can be addressed. Yeah.
I think this is actually quite important issues because older workers are less likely to get training than younger workers. Research has shown that for a long time. And when I discussed this with Eurofund, they were really worried that a lot of employers are reluctant to train older workers. They think these workers are less trainable. This is completely, this is not quite right, because older workers probably need more digital skills than younger workers when they shift to hybrid working. Digital skills is necessary for everybody, but older workers probably need even more training than younger ones. So this is something that government policy could try to address. Like, for example, you could have directives policies requiring employers to spend certain proportion of budget on training older workers, not only focus on young workers.
Thank you, Ying. Thank you, Rita. I'm gonna ask Miguel, that is backstage, to share the results of the poll that we did. And so we asked at the beginning, as this is one of the questions as a school and also in public organizations, we have been thinking a lot, is how can we attract the best talent? And we know that the labor market is changing, that it's more competitive, and that we need to attract talent. And this is what the audience tell us. We can see that giving them more flexibility, that is one of the topics that you raised. I think that also you gave very good examples about how can we start to implement and what actions can we do about improving flexibility in the workplace. Purpose, and Rita just shared the importance of purpose, and this is very related with your research about intrinsic drivers that increase the job quality. Purpose, incentives it might be connected with financial incentives, and then I'm just gonna mention like good work, environment, mission. So I think that this is the main topics, and it's helping us to connect with the closing remarks that Francisco Gaetani is gonna give about this conference. Thank you very much, for the insights, for sharing your research findings, which I think that are very interesting. Also, I invite the audience to look at the Future of Work Research Center that is leading, where they are doing very interesting research on these topics, and also like from a very broad perspective. And thank you, Rita, for your for your insights and for your comments and inputs on this conversation. Thank you. And now I'm going to invite our dearest Francisco Gaetani to share the room. Thank you. Chico, welcome.
Thank you, Margarita. Thank you very much for the opportunity of joining this conference. So rich, the variety of insights, amazing. People from everywhere. I would not say that we are all on the same page, but we all went through similar situations regarding COVID, and the transformations regarding digital transformation at work were accelerated and produced an amazing variety of possibilities. I was very impressed by the positive tone of the conference. So usually when we talk about uncertainties, we talk about it uncertainties in a defensive mode. And here, what I realize is that, okay, there are uncertainties, but wow, let's make the most of these opportunities, which I think it's really, it makes a difference approaching the topic from these perspectives. And I don't know how to start because there are so many interesting points here. I will try to begin with what I thought that maybe we could be missing. First, I think that on the organizational perspective, the situation is far from clear. Organizations don't know how to handle the situation because what was an experiment, now it's a reality. And the re-entry, on the words of Dustin, it has been confusing. It's good that it's confusing. Confusion is better than the wrong certainties, but there's a huge room for negotiation of situations. We all know about the potentialities of hybrid work, but at the same time, it requires a more nuanced management. We'll have to deal with a variety of situations that we now have we have the cases, we have the experiments. And we're talking about situations where you have to take into account people, the nature of the work, the tasks of the organization. And these three things, they are not necessarily balanced. You have to calibrate them. Another thing that I think that somehow it's missing a little bit, and it just show up now at the end of the conversation, the generation stuff, because obviously some people came with chips, others they don't have chips. The digital skills are very unbalanced, but the balance of power in organizations, it's reverse. Usually older people are at the top in hierarchies in the civil service. And they are those who don't know how to handle the digital skills. So I think that we talked about work-life balance, the gender gap, the quality of life. This is all very important. But also we have to incorporate in this process the generation stories. One third point that I think that we should try to focus more precisely is that when we talk about productivity on the organizations, we depend heavily on the corporate systems. And the COVID stuff enabled amazing innovation. So we have now an explosion in the corporate systems, but we realize that maybe people are not so essential as we thought in the way they were. They are important in new roles. So in fact, very roughly speaking, we need less people, but we need people more qualified. Their work is more noble. If you don't want to be replaced by a machine, obviously your work is not supposed to be a replaceable work. We had some situations in Brazil where some institutions that were very reluctant about home office, suddenly they were 100% home office. So the issue of control, presence, usually we joke that if you control presence, you don't control the work, you don't control results. So now we have to rethink all that. And then there is the individual bilateral negotiations between the supervisors and the civil servants. I think that Dusty mentioned that the work of supervisors is very important angle of this conversation because it is. It's very hard to equalize within different sorts of work, the reasonable targets, how to contractualize results. Obviously, we have to take into account also that we're talking about a very heterogeneous world in the terms of civil service, in terms of country, federal, national, local, street level, center of government. There are so many different situations, but the richness of experiences that we have to work now, I think that it's an exceptional opportunity. So if you can re-entry slowly, carefully, keeping the experimentation mode, because it provides a kind of a safe environment for discussing the problems and for improving the arrangements in a kind of in producing win-win situations. That's, I think it's so these three are the points that I think that we should recover. And I just like to say that I think that Tia mentioned something in the beginning that I was so happy that I heard. The word idealist in Portuguese, it's a kind of a bad word. It became somebody without touch, does not have in touch, it's not in touch of reality. It doesn't count. He's an idealist. It's a way of you just take somebody out of the discussion. And she brought the issue about idealizing the future, creating futures, enabling visions. We need different visions for civil service in different parts of the world, in different sort of tasks. This is an amazing opportunity. It's an exceptional opportunity, in fact. But we need creativity. We need to be able to suggest. We need to be able to propose. We need to be able to engage people in creating these situations. Otherwise, we'll come back to our previous situation, which is it's a worst case scenario is thinking about this, where we are now according to the previous lens. It's a good thing that things will not be the same. But okay, so let's think about the future. Let's use the future as our hook to think in terms of what's going on. I don't think that everything is easy, or on the contrary, there are many complications, especially if you observe how the private sector is reacting, and much more dynamic, much more flexible. And then suddenly you see somebody like Elon Musk wanting to everybody to come back to the previous work, the way they were. In Brazil, the private sector, you have flexibility in one extreme, but the institutional organizations, they all want people working as they were working before. The issue about talent that Diogo mentioned, it's a very curious. Sometimes you have how to retain talent, but on the other hand, how to get rid of some talents in some cases. It's very confusing because the talent people, they have never been, they're rotating a lot. They're moving fast. So on the one hand, you need to retain them. On the other hand, can you really retain your talent people? Is it a realistic approach? So the debate between the young people and the old people regarding careers, young people, are they considering really spending 30 years in the civil service? I don't think so. But are there possibilities for them to work in different terms, in different bases? We have to build these possibilities. So there are many issues at stake, and the re-entry, I think, it will be the test, the reality test for what we'll be able to consolidate, what we will be able to keep open, and what we need to change for good. I think these are the challenges now. But anyway, just beginning. It was supposed to be a conversation, Margarita.
Great, Chico. Thank you very much for these closing thoughts. I just want to bring, and we have few minutes to end the conference. You have a huge experience. Now you have many years of experience as a Vice Minister of Planning, Vice Minister of Environment, and President of the National School of Public Administration. We have been talking here about moving from like more traditional leadership to a more flexible. We have talked about flexibility. We have talked about moving, thinking on a more systematic way. Are these topics new? Are they the same? What is the difference from the many years that you have been working and trying to build a strong public organizations, are they new? What is the difference that we see now?
Oh, I would mention two things. First, the teams stuff. You don't do anything alone in government. Government's about teamwork, and the context changed a lot now. And how do the teams perform in this new environment? It's open. We have all the possibilities. Those who do it proper, they are extremely flexible, extremely productive. They're moving to an exceptional performance. But those who miss the kind of environment that enables coexistence and the production of collective production of task knowledge, they are a little bit lost. So we have the two situations, the kind of diverse pattern. The other thing is that the reforms of the 90s, they were about flexibility, okay? And that remains a challenge. But on the other hand, now we have another challenge. What we need to keep minimally institutionalized, stabilized. And the word institutionalized now became a little bit confusing with locked in systems. There's almost a convergence between what we institutionalize is what is embedded in these corporate systems of government. This is not so simple because we're talking about different tribes, different values, and different purpose. So I think that there are many things open now, and we have to address these new challenges in a kind of cautious, open, with a learning attitude, avoiding trying to close the debate too soon, because I think it can backfire. So if we can, we'll have in Brazil probably a coincidence between this moment and the new government. It will be very interesting. We are very excited about because somehow what happened enabled several dreams in terms of, well, imagine reducing the number of hours, like many of the private sectors, there's so many research about that. For some who can move to work in another city. But I saw during the pandemic also, especially mothers, how they have to work with children at home. It was really exhausting. So the gender gap, the gender lack of balance, it's complicated. But for those with parents with health problems, this was a bless. They could support the parents. On the other hand, I think somebody mentioned at the end here, there are logistic issues and technical issues regarding working from home on corporate basis. These are not trivial. It's not just a notebook. You need a lot of human capital. You need upskill your profile. You need several issues that have to be organized properly. But especially at local level, there are two areas that we are completely education and health. Education is an open drama. It's okay. We have distance learning. It's complicated. That's a public debate. But health is a war because it affects the patient-physician relationship and the cooperation of physicians. I don't know. We barely touched the subject because in health, at the end of the day, it's one of the most important civil services that population demands. So this, at least in terms of the street level bureaucracy at local level, I think that the social workers, teachers, and health workers will have many things to discuss how to handle in the future. It changed, and you'll not be able to undo what happened. You have to do other things, beginning from how it was before, with how it has been, and how it should be. So I think that in these areas, the stories will be more complex.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chico. We have just 1 minute left, and one just to say thank you to all panelists, speakers that joined us today. A huge thank you to the audience, to the participants. We will continue to share thoughts, ideas, insights on this topic, and looking forward for future engagement. Huge applause to all of you. It's Friday and it's already 4:05, and we are closing this conference. Thank you, Chico. Thank you, the speakers, and thank you to the participants. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.